Many of us in the online fandom and creative spaces are familiar with terms such as pro-ship and anti. There's a great deal of discourse out there about these respective labels, though rarely are those of us who use them asked what exactly it is that we mean. Much ink has been spilt about how dangerous online creative spaces have become in recent years, with increased instances of doxing, stalking, cyberbullying, and other antisocial behaviors. Contrary to what some adult tax-paying women may believe, there is considerable evidence that the danger is in fact quite real and overrepresented by the side who believes itself to be ethically superior based on fiction consumption habits. Even more concerningly, the mindset used to justify this behavior is not limited to fandom spaces, but is echoed across more and more places in society. Using intuition to justify censure or condemnation of materials one finds distasteful can be seen everywhere from fanfiction websites to libraries, all the way up to think tanks preparing to outlaw the very existence of queer people in public. The purpose of this video is not to cover these cases or to examine the modern state of fandom, though in the description you'll find links to websites, videos, and academic papers who go into detail on the topic. Rather, in this video, we're going to analyze the so-called anti-position, some of the premises necessary to believe in it, and common rebuttals we hear from antis themselves. We're going to expand the scope from shipping wars to fictional criticism more broadly. We'll be covering the creation and consumption of fiction, sometimes referred to as fantasy, and in which cases it makes sense to attribute moral blame. Going forward, we'll be examining the philosophical positions on the so-called pro-fiction side and the opposing side. But first, a disclaimer. There's a bit of an asymmetry in the use conventions of the terms pro-fic and anti. An enthusiast more in line with pro-fic discourse is more likely to refer to themselves with the label than any fan is likely to refer to themselves as an anti ever. The term anti seems to function as something of an exonym, denoting someone who is outside of an in-group. In this case, the in-group is a philosophical position, while the out-group is the opposing position. The potential negative connotation means that many people who use the talking points of so-called antis may not in fact identify as such. Therefore, rather than arguing with self-identified antis, I will focus on the philosophical tendency colloquially referred to as anti-rhetoric. And as others have argued much better than I can, they pose considerable real-world harm, especially when it comes to marginalized communities such as racial and sexual minorities. The pro-fic position. It is impossible to know anything reliably about an individual based on their fiction consumption habits alone. Fictional content does not have a reliable or straightforward connection to reality by default. Thus, consenting adults should not be subject to moral judgment over fiction, nor should access to their desired fictional content be restricted. The anti-position. It is possible to pass moral judgment on a person based on the fictional content that person creates or consumes. The same moral judgment can be used to limit or possibly eliminate certain fictional content from public consumption. Now look, it's not often that you hear someone just straight up say this directly, right? But what can be a bit concerning is how often folks we might otherwise look up to end up mindlessly spouting talking points in line with this way of thinking. Some recent examples include the massive scandal when K-pop star Subin, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, mentioned watching the award-winning dark fantasy series Made in Abyss. The online harassment campaign which ensued proceeded to slander several associated stars as pedophiles and predators for even watching the show. A string of targeted doxing and harassment campaigns have struck the creator of indie horror game The Coffin of Andy and Lele after being harassed online for weeks for supposedly glorifying incest. But even if we get away from these larger instances, casual call-out culture is rife with instances of this thought process. Take a look.
Don't know why, but there are always going to be certain parts of the internet that are extremely dark, really disturbing, just like overall really disgusting. Does it mean that it's okay? Of course, certainly not. Not at all. Because a lot of the time it starts here and then it progresses even further to really disturbing in real life stuff. I just have a problem with the fact that TikTok hasn't taken a lot of these videos down.
It is important to watch not only the media that you consume, but call it out whenever there is a prominent issue in it. Because of the fact that if you don't, it's going to continue to happen. Anything that paints minors in the 21st century in a romantic and sexual light needs to be like banned. You should not be entertaining no type of entertainment or content like that whatsoever. I just feel like pertaining to anything, if you wouldn't do it in real life, why entertain the thought or the drawing or content that depicts those things in fiction?
That type of dynamic of toxic and assault and very abusive relationship is framed to be kind of romantic in the book. I mean, there's literally a scene where the love interest sexually assaults the main character. The criticism for that scene has gotten so bad that Colleen had to come out with an apology video on Facebook. And with later releases, that whole scene was edited out and removed. I mean, thank God, but just to imagine that she thought it was okay to put that scene in.
It's like, who is the target audience for this? Because it's not kids. It can't be kids, you know? So I started to realize this is either for unsupervised young teens or adult men that can't talk to women. Like, if you are in your 20s and you don't know how to talk to women, you cope by watching Dress Up Darling. And in a way, it does kind of ruin anime for me because the target audience are these, like, perverted weirdos. And so the majority of anime being created are designed for these perverted weirdos. I mean, let's be honest. About like 7/8 of the anime out there are hot garbage. And it feels degrading saying, yeah, I'll watch anime. Not any of the weird ones though. I watch the good anime. I shouldn't have to say that. And it's because people do know that anime is catered to perverted, socially outcasted weirdos. And I got proof of this too. And I know the iFunny comment section isn't the best evidence, but...
Also, somebody in my last video tried to correct me by saying, oh, but pro-shipping doesn't mean shipping illegal stuff solely. Yeah, I know that's not what I meant to say. I meant to say that it is still allowing that kind of behavior to exist, allowing people to find incestuous or other illegal or moral types of couples cute in the, context that they're fictional. But fiction directly affects reality, and I think if you've been on the internet for more than 0.5 seconds, I think you would know that.
We got this shit, which is Aftermath. Tell me this is not a child. Tell me this is not a child. Arsad be damned. Tell me this is not a motherfucking child. Oh my god, there is even a little plushie over here. This is so fucking gross. Oh my god. Morning after, you know what? Wow, these infantilizing motherfucking terms. And also the audacity of throwing this shit in between these two. He posted this shit and then he was like, yeah, let's go back to her being a child. And then he bones her. Oh my god, the fucking nerve. Now the next page is her who's puking all day. She's pregnant. She goes back to the place where she was a child and met this man, and now she's pregnant with his child. Yeah, that's normal. That's a good story to romanticize. And that's basically the story at this point. So that's all very, very, very weird, as I'm sure we can all agree. The problem is, we can't all agree on that because I'm looking at the fucking comments and I'm having an existential panic right now. Am I in a universe where grooming is suddenly okay? There was no semblance of a sane human being in those comments. And at the time, I tried rationalizing it in my mind, The only reason why some people can't see why this is wrong is that there are many, many chins. They're getting chuffed by their neckbeards. They're blocking the bloodstream to the brain. They must be blocking the bloodstream to the brain as they look down to read this shit on their greasy ass phone with the military grade carbon phone case. Why do they always have the motherfucking carbon phone case as if their phone would ever be dropped anywhere else other than carpet, as if they ever leave them?
All of this makes me wonder, why did it need to be gay in the first place? Was there anything said in this comic that couldn't have been conveyed if Yunbom was a woman, or even if Songwo was a woman? Were the sex scenes actually necessary? Did they fulfill a pivotal use in driving the plot? Character, yes, but were so many of them necessary? Maybe if Yunbom was a woman, the author would have been more sparing in their use of physical abuse. Maybe it would have hit too close to home. But by making Bum a man, it allows a layer of disconnect. And all of the major plot beats worth talking about don't seem to include any elements of sex whatsoever. And it's these sexual moments that the fans latch onto and say, yes, the romance is real, Songwo just needs a chance to open up. Survivors of abuse can often feel very isolated, so seeing someone who has been hurt like them in fiction can be very cathartic. But all of these things are being overshadowed by how a fetishistically appropriative audience has turned it into a romance novel. And this is concerning to me. Not just about how these people read the media they consume, but also if they might think that this type of relationship is normal. Do they have the ability to understand when they are in an abusive relationship? Are they going to do the right things and confront their friends when they're in an abusive relationship? Or are they going to push through and encourage others to do so in the hope that something beautiful will blossom out of the trauma? Or are they completely aware of what is safe and acceptable for them, but their ideas are different for queer people?
In these clips, and countless others like them, we see calls for and celebrations of bans on fictional content, outlandish accusations made about creators and fans, some of which make fun of actual victims, conflation of real-world actions with fictional consumption, and misogyny and other forms of general bigotry. Takes like these are as common as they are annoying, and don't even get me started on the toxic cesspool that is social media. Now, it goes without saying that under no circumstances should we harass any one of these creators or anyone else who has bad takes. But to be honest, my platform is much smaller than any of theirs, so I'm probably more likely at risk here. At any rate, let's take a deeper look into the two rival philosophical factions in modern fandom. Anti-arguments tend to fall into one of three categories. Number 1. There is a reliable, predictable connection between fictional representations and reality. This connection is causal and potentially bidirectional. It is both obvious and intuitive, and can thus be made by casual observers. One of the most frequent statements enjoyers of taboo fiction will encounter is this idea that the consumption of fictional representations of things which are bad in real life will either lead a person to seek the real thing out or have a sympathetic view of the corresponding behavior. Variations on this theme are accusations of fetishization of antisocial behavior, such as sexual assault, or people, often women, being unable to tell fact from fiction. Now, these are falsifiable claims. There is no reputable evidence that links the enjoyment of taboo subjects to their real-life counterparts. On the contrary, most therapists and researchers affirm that taboo fantasy is quite common and not linked to the acceptance of the corresponding antisocial behavior.
Often, our fantasies involve things that are taboo, things that are forbidden, things that we feel that we can't express in everyday life, and the simple fact that it's taboo and forbidden is what makes it exciting and titillating. That doesn't mean you actually want it in your everyday life. Often fantasies come from a variety of different places. Some memory of something, some book that you read. It becomes this kind of mishmash in your mind. But there's a lot of variability in sexual fantasies, and they don't tell you anything reliable about you. If you have fantasies that disturb you or scare you and you wonder what they mean, they don't mean a lot.
There is an enormous amount of research on this topic, and I invite viewers to look into it for themselves, but on its face, this very argument shouldn't be as convincing as it appears to be to so many people. There are many simulations of undesirable real-life situations that we're exposed to on a daily basis. Does anyone really believe that Call of Duty players are latent spree shooters? Does watching slasher fiction indicate a desire to engage in gory murder? Are bungee jumpers or skydivers suicidal for simulating a fall to their deaths? These are absurd assumptions, but they follow a similar logic. The only time fictional representations are called into question is when they are in some way sexual. Westerners, and those from Abrahamic backgrounds in general, tend to ascribe special importance to the representation of taboo sexuality, specifically assault, age gaps, and incest. Again, there is no evidence that fiction which includes sexual representations are any more or less likely to encourage real-world behavior than violent ones. On the other hand, there may even be some evidence that violence and sexuality are processed in the brain in similar ways. But let's take this assumption at face value. A visit to any adult film-oriented site will quickly reveal that forms of incest are in heavy abundance. Are we prepared to say that these videos are grooming viewers to engage in such acts with their family? Then why are we so quick to assume that the reader of Killing Stalking won't be able to recognize real-life abuse from a partner? Or that enjoying Made in Abyss will numb us to the suffering of real-life children? We can critique real-world harm without allowing our quite understandable disgust at such behavior to confuse fiction and reality. Number 2. The existence of certain fictional representations has observable impacts on society at large. The presence or absence of such representations in some predetermined quantity will have a reliable, measurable impact on members of society. Therefore, fictional representations should be judged based on their relationship to social cultivation. This argument differs from the previous one in that rather than drawing a one-to-one line between fiction and reality, it makes the slightly weaker claim that representations impact society in general. In some ways, this is unquestionably true. Representations of fashion impact how we dress, speech patterns how we speak. If representations didn't impact our purchasing behavior, the entire field of advertising would become obsolete overnight. Post-9/11 representations of Arab and other brown people on American television tended to portray those populations as criminals, which reflected contemporary sentiments. On the other hand, increased visibility of queer characters in television and movies corresponded with increased social acceptance. However, we cannot extrapolate from these examples that all representations serve the same function. There is no correlation to be found between slasher films and murder, or between violent video games and aggression. Contrarily, and here I anticipate a little bit of pushback, I don't know that there's any connection between reducing sexualized representations of women in media and reduction of offenses against women. Telling young women not to read Colleen Hoover isn't going to reduce cases of SA, just as preventing young men from playing Mortal Kombat won't prevent street fights. We don't protect vulnerable populations from harm, nor do we prevent offenders from offending by limiting artistic expression, including expressions that we don't like. Encouraging pro-social behaviors needs to come in the form of direct action, such as in-school education, improved economic circumstances, and rewarding good behavior. A variant of the social impact argument is the idea that fiction has the potential to be harmful to individuals. Thus, creators and consumers have an obligation to restrict access to potentially harmful fictional depictions, especially from vulnerable communities. Now, on this point, most people are in agreement. No one should be forced to consume content that makes them uncomfortable. Also, minors should definitely not be exposed to explicit depictions except in very special circumstances, such as education or other situations that have expressed parental consent. Limiting exposure to what can reasonably be seen as consensual is very important. The only issue is where we decide to draw that line. There are very few places on the internet that are both publicly available and allow reasonable free expression. The siloing of all fiction that you wouldn't read in front of your grandmother to sites solely dedicated to such purposes presents more options for censorship, targeted harassment of websites and users, and also severely limits creators and fans, both in their ability to grow and to find one another. This is why pro-fic enthusiasts are very careful about tagging systems, content warnings, and DNIs. This way, taboo content is not totally hidden from the public, but those who want or need to avoid such content have the ability to do so. More education about curating one's online experience and more tagging options should be more widely available on commonly used websites. Also, let's be real, no one really believes that fiction should only depict pure pro-social behavior. They only say this when they don't like the fiction that someone else consumes. Number 3. Fictional representations have inherent moral value, irrespective of their relationship to goings-on in reality. The content of a fictional representation can be subject to moral judgment in a coherent and self-contained manner. This is perhaps the most sophisticated of the anti-arguments. Rather than focusing on a relationship between creation, consumption, and behavior, which is obviously fairly tenuous, this category of arguments posits that fantasy itself may be subject to moral criticism. We know from experience that certain behaviors are in fact antisocial, and creating or engaging in fantasy of such behaviors may be cultivating an immoral desire. Desiring to harm an innocent person is an immoral act, regardless of if the act is carried out or not. The obvious rebuttal to this is that moral calculus is only ever meaningful when real harm is, at least in theory, possible. Desiring to kill your friend because they annoy you is qualitatively different from desiring to kill an NPC in a video game. In the absence of harm, even in theory, how can moral blame be attributed in a consistent way? It's like dividing by zero. On the other hand, there are many ways to interpret and interact with fiction. Limiting that which may in some cases induce morally reprehensible fantasies should be subject to a very high burden of proof, because this line of reasoning is nearly always used to stifle creativity and often to persecute minorities. We often see this kind of thought process play out in so-called kink-critical spaces, where people are shamed for the consensual play they engage in behind closed doors. We see the same when lambasting fans for appreciation of fan service in games or anime, or when deriding young women for their taste in smutty literature, or survivors for supposedly romanticizing their abuse. If only these people were sufficiently curious about their fantasies, so the argument goes, they would inevitably realize that even engaging in the fantasy itself perpetuates harm. But the evidence of such harm simply isn't there. It's based on an argument from disgust, rather than an earnest engagement with creators and fans. Look, it's very easy to feel defeated at the existence of horrible actions in the world, and it's understandable why this may lead some to exert power over something they feel they can control, namely fiction. There's a really good article linked below about the elimination of problematic content from public consumption. To paraphrase a point that Gomes makes, one of the reasons for this moral panic may be due to life under late-stage capitalism. Consumption itself becomes a moral act of equal importance to real-world behavior. Being otherwise stripped of our agency, it's easy to internalize this religion of consumerism and believe that salvation can only be achieved through ethical consumption. Hopefully, I need not explain why that's impossible. At the end of the day, when engaging in moral calculus, an indispensable factor should be real-world harm. A verifiable connection to reality is absolutely necessary, and as we demonstrated above, such connections can and do exist. When the logical result of our criticism is censorship or condemnation, however, demonstrating that a connection to reality is based off of more than feels and vibes should be our standard. And now for some common rebuttals. There exists fiction, as well as engagement with fiction, that does have an observable connection to reality. Therefore, judging others on their fictional consumptive habits is valid. Again, no one is arguing that there is zero connection between fiction and reality. Rather, what we argue is that the connection is neither reliable nor obvious, and must be demonstrated clearly before engaging a judgment. In cases such as the Turner Diaries or the recent rash of violent fantasies involving killing minorities in Grand Theft Auto 6, the connection between creator, consumer, and content is clear and undeniable. Take the Turner Diaries, for instance. It was created with an identifiable, real-world desired outcome, born out of an undeniable hatred for real-world minorities. Its proponents make no uncertain claims about their desires for social engineering. Likewise, those openly fantasizing about deliberately harming NPCs of color in Grand Theft Auto 6 because of their minority status is also tied to real-world grievances, and these users aim to use these fictional acts of violence in order to deliberately torment people in the real world that they don't like. There is intentionality there. In such cases, when we look at creation, discussion, consumption, online sharing, etc., it is clear that there is a demonstrable hatred of an identifiable group in reality, or an antisocial call to action in reality. The overwhelming majority of taboo fiction consumed by pro-fic enthusiasts fails to meet this standard. There's no call to action in Bakudeku fanfiction, no hatred or harm toward any real-world persons or groups. Neither of these characters are a stand-in for a real-world category of people. They are self-referential abstractions. 2. Real-world fiction is often made without the expressed consent of the celebrity figure in the content, and it can involve actual minors. Real-life fiction is potentially a very gray area, because the tie to reality is indeed present and undeniable. While some people argue that the real person in the creative work is still a fictional representation, for instance, in the case of K-pop idols, whose fabricated public image is at least partially the work of their talent agency, this argument is not airtight in my humble opinion. And in the case of minors, we should be willing to draw a very hard line. Not only is it harmful to the subjects in question, but also illegal, and a clear case of CSEM. With RLF, proceed with caution, but be prepared for those instances when valid criticism arises. To accept the pro-fic position is to deny the history of literary and media criticism. If the connection between fiction and reality is so flimsy, how can we say anything about it at all? This is something I myself once believed. The fact of the matter is that literary and media criticism has existed for thousands of years, under many different paradigms and cultural lenses. Different people create works for different reasons, and under many different circumstances. There's no such thing as a view-from-nowhere form of criticism, no timeless or objective perspective on a creative work. All criticisms are through a particular lens. Looking at a piece of fiction through a lens of reality is valid, but not more valid than any other lens. And also, we should stop mistaking personal opinion for media analysis. Sexual violation is a frequent occurrence throughout Berserk's Golden Age arc, involving most female characters with any spoken lines, and all three of the central characters, Guts, Casca, and Griffith. It is hellish and brutal, both when it is visually depicted and when it is not. Sexual violation impacts every victim immensely, staying with them for years after the fact, often determining pivotal actions in that character's future, such as Guts' inability to enjoy intimate touch, or the princess's complete withdrawal from her father, the king. The only character who experiences a form of SA and claims to remain unscathed is the godlike Griffith. After selling his body to a serial child abuser, Griffith is united with the man many years later, and coolly informs him that their activities had no lasting impact on him whatsoever, before calmly ending his life. According to the text, sexual violation is one of the most damaging and vulnerable forms of violence, one that ordinary mortals are irrevocably impacted by. The prevalence of sexual assault in Berserk's Golden Age arc makes this otherwise expertly crafted story basically unwatchable. The fetishization of feminine weakness is presented to stimulate the reader. Miura's fascination with violence toward women's bodies is indicative of a deeper problem of misogyny in action-adventure manga. This arc appeals to some of the worst people in the fandom, and its glorification of SA is deeply problematic. The story would have been much better if Miura had some basic understanding of feminist media critique. In the former example, we look at how SA is depicted within the text, how it impacts the story and its characters, and a possible conclusion about its importance within this fictional world. In the latter, meanwhile, we see the viewer's personal preference, and some unsubstantiated claims about the connection between depictions, the author, and the readers. Now look, opinions are fine in a review, but they are not a substitute for proper media analysis, and importantly, should never be used as a justification for censorship. I have an entire video planned about media criticism that focuses on this question specifically, so please stay tuned for that if you're at all interested. The bottom line. To be honest, this video got a bit away from me. This started off as a few notes scribbled hither and thither after seeing some particularly egregious takes online. I remember once lying on my friend's couch during a brief trip to America, and I was reading the book Out Stealing Horses by Per Petterson. There's a recurring theme in the book that we first encounter when the protagonist is recalling a tale from his youth. He says, "I had done such a miserable job and had not dared cut down the nettles with the short scythe because I was afraid that it would hurt. And then my father had just pulled them up with his bare hands, saying, 'You decide for yourself when it will hurt.'" The idea that you decide for yourself when it will hurt really stuck with me. There are many places in life where this is applicable, but none quite so much as the world of fiction. There are many awful things that can happen in this world, and trust me, I'm no stranger to many of them. That can leave a deep impact on how we experience the world, including stories that are meant to entertain. But those feelings that we have are ours and ours alone, and we are responsible for them. Learning how to manage those feelings is an important part of growing up. This excerpt from Mary Gateskill on not being a victim is a perfect encapsulation of the growth process and how we reconcile our own feelings with fiction. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I could not bear to watch movies or read books that I considered demeaning to women in any way. I evaluated everything I saw or read in terms of whether or not it expressed a positive image of women. I was a very PC feminist before the term existed, and by measure of my current understanding, my critical rigidity followed from my inability to be responsible for my own feelings. In this context, Being responsible would have meant that I let myself feel whatever discomfort, indignation, or disgust I experienced without allowing those feelings to determine my entire reaction to a given piece of work. In other words, it would have meant dealing with my feelings and what it caused them, rather than expecting the outside world to assuage them. I could have chosen not to see the world through the lens of my personal unhappiness, and yet maintained a kind of respect for my unhappiness. For example, I could have decided to avoid certain films or books because of my feelings, without blaming the film or book for making me feel the way I did. But let me summarize. Here on the Profix side, we strongly believe in an individual's liberty to consume what they want and avoid what they do not. Finding something distasteful or even morally reprehensible is valid, but it's never a reason to make any other person in a fandom space feel unsafe. Temper your judgments to be appropriate to the context. These are fictional characters and worlds. There is no reason to engage in real-world harm for their sake. If there are any other essential arguments from either side that you feel I've neglected, please let me know in the comments below, and I will see you here next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe.